Welcome to the Dodger Games channel and another Mormon Truth video. Today I'm going to be getting pretty personal. Today's video is going to be basically about how the Mormon Church helped destroy my family and kill my child. That should be plural because it's basically killing my children. And so today's video is a little different, and I'm probably going to share this with personal friends and Facebook friends, some of which are personal friends and some of which who I don't know, not on the Dodger Davidson Facebook page, which is for the persona of the Dodger Game channel where the Mormon Truth videos are done on YouTube, but for my personal one as Dave, people that have actually known me and where I have essentially outed myself so far as my feelings regarding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recently, probably much to the chagrin of caring members of the church who know me and who are indoctrinated as I have been in the belief system taught in the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when we're referring to the largest sect of Mormonism, which, as they all do, claim to be the true successors of Joseph Smith, though not the one that his family followed, nor the three witnesses, nor the bishop of the church, nor the patriarch, the stake president of Nauvoo, all of whom followed Joseph Smith's appointee by letter. Whether or not that was a fraudulent letter, it was accepted by Emma, his wife, his mother, his brother, and his brothers who survived Brigham Young, and his sisters. That would have been James Strang, who was later assassinated, and Joseph Smith III was asked to lead the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now the Community of Christ. So, without getting into too much history on that, I'm going to get into the personal side here. So I'm taking a walk in the park today, using a headset and microphone, try to make sound quality good, and probably screwing it up by walking. But I'm staying on the grass and trying to walk quietly like a Nephite or a Lamanite, right? Yeah. So I've had some emotional encounters or blow-ups, basically, with a couple of my older children recently, involving our lives and Mormonism. And that's part of the reason I decided to do this video today, because of the influence of Mormonism and the falling out because of Mormonism, or much to do with Mormonism, and the devastation of our family, in large part due to Mormonism. Mormonism, the church that says they keep families together forever if you just are faithful and righteous. But that's actually not the case. We know that the double bind technique is used through mind control, using the carrot and the stick and the binding in with the ordinances in the temple and the belief system that is inculcated and ingrained deeply into the members through programming that is done very perniciously, although that is from the top, and people like me who helped mind control my own children for the church we're doing so basically through assimilation of the processes, not through understanding what we were doing and whom we were serving. So, the belief system in Mormonism teaches us that in a pre-existent spiritual life, in a life where we lived on a planet near the star Kolob, in the center of the universe, or the center of a galaxy at least, we were born as spirit children to that being that we call God the Father in Mormonism, and one of his wives, a goddess, whose name is too sacred to mention, apparently, in Mormonism, and that we proved ourselves as worthy and valiant by arguing tenaciously for and in behalf of the plan of free agency as put forth by the Son, the firstborn spirit child of this Father God, which Joseph Smith decided we must call Elohim, which is Hebrew for the gods. And that spirit son was named Jehovah, apparently. That's what it's taught to us as in the endowment in the temple. Jehovah, which is interesting, as I've said before. I'm not going to dwell on this, but, you know, that's pretty impossible since that name wasn't made up till like the 13th century by a Catholic monk, whom, of course, belongs to what Mormon leaders have taught us and what the Book of Mormon essentially describes as the Catholic Church being the church called the Great and Abominable Church of the Devil in 1 Nephi chapter 13. So we followed the plan of Jehovah, who became Jesus Christ in LDS theology. And we fought against Lucifer, who became Satan in LDS theology. Because Lucifer wanted to force us to obey the commandments given and frustrate the entire purpose of testing our loyalty and integrity in what we call earth life or mortal life, a trial period where we can show our worthiness, our loyalty, kind of the way you'd show loyalty in a secret society or maybe a military organization. Or as Joseph Smith put it, that we would show that we are willing to serve him, meaning God, the God of Mormonism, at all hazards, and that he would pull at our heartstrings and test us. And if we gave in, if we didn't weather the test, we would be found unworthy and lose our potential exaltation, which is the purpose of joining the Mormon Church. The purpose is not to be saved, per se, as Christians believe. The purpose is to become a god and or a goddess. Not and or, that would be a transvestite right now. A god or a goddess, male or female. To create worlds, have spirit children, and create a spiritual family as we are taught God the Father did. And those of us who were most valiant were born into white, Northern European descent families who join the LDS Church or are born into the church. Those who are less valiant are Gentiles. Those who are even less valiant in arguing for Jesus or Jehovah in that war in heaven were born with darker skin, maybe Chinese or American Indian, whom were cursed to be called Lamanites. They were less valiant in their premortal existence. And if you absolutely didn't really care and just waited to see who the winner was, you were called a fence sitter, and you were born through black lineage. And therefore you were denied the priesthood because you were a descendant of Cain. That's what was taught earlier in Mormonism, which now the church says is false doctrine. Though leader after leader taught this. And so, being valiant was what it's all about. And if you don't believe that the church leaders are true representatives of a perfect God, if you don't agree with their teachings, if you live your life on your own terms, you are considered to be unworthy. You are considered to be scum if you are not abiding the Mormon code of morality, of chastity, of modesty. And many young Mormons, like every other type of person, find that they don't necessarily agree with the behavioral modification code enforced as worthiness and programmed into the children as worthiness of their conduct. Some of my kids have expressed to me how they felt and were made to feel by the teachings they received at church about how unworthy they were if they had any sexual forays outside of or before entering into a marriage, especially a Mormon temple marriage. They were taught that they were better off dead. It was better that they had been killed than to have lost their virtue. One of the church presidency, Marion G. Romney, I believe it was, related a story to drive this point home regarding how important it is to hang on to virginity and calling it virtue, which indicates purity and power. In a story where a young man came home from a mission and his father told him it was better that he had come home in a coffin, dead, than if he had had any sexual activity outside of marriage, which is supposed to be ordained of this God of Israel, as we are told. We're told that marriage was instituted by this God, and that the first flesh on the earth, according to Joseph Smith and his God-given translation of the Bible, was Adam. The first flesh on the earth, the first man also. That's what it says in the book of Moses, which is the retranslation of Genesis by Joseph Smith. The word translation being used rather loosely. So enforcing modesty, which prevents, as in Mormon teaching, kids from getting involved in what is called immorality, because you're immoral if you are involved with anyone sexually outside a legal covenant, especially as they're told it should be in the temple. But to get married in the temple, of course, you first have to accept the Mormon endowment, and at that time, of course, it meant you were accepting the demonic and depraved penalties of secrecy from the Freemasons from which Joseph Smith stole the signs, tokens, and penalties used in the temple to bind people to covenants, particularly covenants of allegiance to the church and its leaders. The willingness to give everything you have to the church, your time, your talents, everything with which the Lord has blessed you, and everything with which the Lord will bless you. And basically, in Mormonism, anything that you get that's good comes from the God who they say governs the church. And so you owe everything to the church. Your time, your talents, your money, anything they ask, whether it's 10% of your gross income in tithing, or if they say, sell everything and give it to the church, as was done in the times of Joseph Smith. When he and Sidney Rigdon were, forcing people to give everything to the church in Caldwell County, for instance. And the Mormon why can't I come up with a word? Anyway, the order to comply or be thrust out or killed was given, and then that was copied basically back against them by the governor. And of course, Mormons are taught about what the governor said of the state, but not what Sidney Rigdon gave on his 4th of July speech. So, giving everything to the church is something that's done by covenant. And if you don't do that, if you don't covenant to give anything you are asked, your time in callings in the church to serve this multi-billion-dollar corporation, on missions, on Sunday, and giving 10% of your gross income, well, you can't get married in the temple for time and all eternity as you're promised, which is the whole point of Mormonism, is to become gods and goddesses, have your own families and worlds, and children to worship you, apparently, if you act like Elohim, and keep your loved ones forever. That is the carrot. And the stick is that you will be deprived of this unless you comply with what you are told from the hierarchy of the church, from the top right on down to raising your hand to say, I support my bishop and all of our local leaders and sustain them in their callings, meaning you will obey. You will serve as asked. You will give as directed. You will be a pawn for the Mormon church, or you won't have your family forever. And as Joseph Smith said, like I was saying earlier, you will be tested. God will pull at your heartstrings and make a sacrifice like unto basically what we find in the Bible story of Abraham, geared to your own capacity. In other words, as much as you can possibly take. Of course, we know that Abraham was asked to murder his child and give it as a blood atonement sacrifice to the God of Israel. And then at the last moment, after he showed he was willing to murder his son in order to obey this God, then there was the reprieve, and an animal was provided to murder in that story. We've had other stories in church that tell us the same sort of message. A man holding a bridge together with a lever as his son was being run over by a train so that all the people on the train wouldn't fall in the water and drown. I always hated that story. And I hated the story of Abraham. I didn't want to be disloyal to my family for the church. But when my son My youngest son from my initial marriage needed some help, more than I could give at the time anymore. I had come up from Central America. I had risked everything and lost everything trying to save him from heroin. And I was no longer able to do what needed to be done. He needed a place to stay. I wanted him to stay with my oldest son at that point, after basically I was in ruins. And in the midst of a nervous breakdown. My oldest son had to choose between Mormonism and his brother, because his brother might drink a beer in his house, and of course they probably consecrated their house to serving the Lord God of Mormonism. That would make his house unholy, because your home is supposed to be holy like a temple in Mormonism. If you have paid off the mortgage and supposedly own it, which is a joke since you're always a tenant in the United States, and you never own anything in the Lodium, that's just why they can take it if you don't pay the rent called property taxes. You then dedicate the house, just as a temple is dedicated, as Joseph Smith copied the example of the Freemasons, whose Masonic temple dedications he, with Brigham Young, went to, as recorded in Joseph Smith's own journal. At least one that I read of, reading his stuff. And my son, my oldest son, and his wife had decided to serve the Lord of Mormonism. Choose ye this day whom you shall serve. As for me and my household, I will serve the Lord, as it is written in the Old Testament. And he, trying to be valiant, was put in this position of keeping his house holy for the Lord, or taking in his brother, who had come off of heroin but was still struggling. He elected to turn his brother away, along in conjunction with his wife. In the conversation I had with his wife said, "How dare you guilt your son for this? You're making him feel guilty if he won't take in his brother." And I replied, and I can't say that I'm quoting directly from her or from me, but the gist of it was, yes, and he is guilty if he does this thing. So recently, when some of these things kind of came to a head in some conversation, I mentioned this, and I said, you chose your religion over your brother, and now he's dead. And I understand he doesn't feel too good about that, or what I said. He has blocked me on Facebook and Messenger and messages and everything else, according to what I'm told by other family members, because in my anger, in a previous encounter over certain other issues, I used language that is not holy in Mormonism or Christianity. I dropped some F-bombs. And yes, I get emotional. I've got a lot of feelings here. I've had family destroyed. I've lost one child, probably my most brilliant child, and he was extremely kind. Well, I've got some brilliant children. I don't want to make anyone else feel badly, but this guy was a genius and very kind, and I think we all were greatly traumatized by his death. Though, like I said, I came back to the United States to try to help him, and it took too long. We lost our business. We moved to Mexico. I had a nervous breakdown, and my wife left me and took our children. And I wasn't able to see them for 5 years, and I've never seen my son again. My daughter I saw for a few moments. And my project next, now that the winter is ending, is to continue that battle to retrieve them, to get back in their lives and them in my life, and hope that I can be a good influence. I tried to be the best dad that I could. Yet, I see the damage of Mormonism and the psychological damage that has occurred to my children because of what they were programmed to believe was God's true word. Now I'm going to talk about things that Mormonism did to destroy my marriage with my second wife, or to make it difficult. She left when I couldn't support the family, when I broke down. However, and we actually got along great, but there were some challenging times, and I think she draws upon those to help justify what she did, which violates Mormon scripture completely, or the Book of Mormon. Because I was a faithful husband, I tried to be the best husband I could. I was, I think, the best dad I've ever met. Yeah, I'm arrogant. No, I really tried hard. I spent as much time as I could with my kids. I prioritized them. My only thing I can say is that's bad is that sometimes I went surfing. But my second wife, who was, really a great person in my opinion, and a wonderful girl, came from another country, and apparently her parents didn't teach her the doctrine of Cain well enough. And she wound up marrying a guy who was partially Negroid. Therefore, her daughters were descendants of Cain in Mormon doctrine. People who, in the presence of God, couldn't choose between God and Jesus Christ. That's what I was taught. And of course, that's what I believed. Otherwise, I wouldn't be Mormon if I thought they lied to me. And as much as people look and say, oh, wow, how could anyone be so racist? You have to look at the logic behind this. That people don't all get F's and they don't all get A's in school. We have varying degrees of success or diligence in all kinds of pursuits. And in this particular thing, this is the doctrine that's still taught in the patriarchal blessings in the LDS Church, that if you were declared to be of the seed of Joseph who was sold into Egypt, that you were valiant, especially Ephraim. You were valiant in following the Lord when you could plainly see who to choose, God or Lucifer, who became Satan. And so some people are going to be less valiant. Some people are going to just choose the devil. And they were cast down as the angels of the devil, or the third of the host of heaven in Mormon theology, and I believe probably in Christian theology. Those who sat on the fence were Negroes, as I said earlier, and those who were somewhere more valiant than them, but not so much as us good descendants of Ephraim from the chosen race. Sorry, there's a helicopter going over. We're born into lesser homes, as we have Mark E. Peterson of the Quorum of the 12 carefully explaining to us in General Conference. So, as much as I tried to love these daughters, I also had to know that they just really weren't valiant. They didn't care about right versus wrong. They didn't stand up for truth and righteousness in the pre-mortal existence. They just were selfish. That is what Mormon doctrine taught me. I couldn't instruct them to date or marry white people and pollute the chosen race with the seed of Cain because of Mormon doctrine. And my wife knew that I had this stance, although she didn't probably understand thoroughly where it came from. She had to have some understanding, and yet she didn't seem to resent the church, so I guess she just didn't get it. She just said, "You are a racist." Of course I'm a racist. I'm a Mormon. Mormonism is racism. Christianity is racism. Christianity says the Jewish race is the only worthy race. And if you read the Jewish text in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Yahweh was having them just kill other people in other cultures, races, and religions. There was no religious tolerance. There was no racial tolerance. Even Jesus in the New Testament told the Canaanitish woman that he came to serve and his blessings were intended for the house of Israel, the children of Israel, and not for the dogs. But she said, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And so, in that story, he decided to heal her son, even though she was from that Canaanitish or Phoenician, which if you do the, biblical genealogies are still going to show Canaanitish lineage. And so I was indoctrinated in this, and I studied what the leaders of the church said. I was an employee of the church. I had a lot of time to listen to cassette tapes, recordings of General Conference, of BYU addresses by general authorities while I was working. And so I had a cassette tape player that I hitched on my belt, and an earphone, and one of those little earplugs, and I listened. I listened to General Conference talk after General Conference talk. I listened to the scriptures on tape. I listened to all this stuff, and I read, and I had a calling for the church as a bookstore operator. That's a calling from the church I had. I didn't get paid, but for our elders quorum to fund itself and its activities, a Deseret bookstore was what I ran for the church. It wasn't just Deseret. We had Deseret, Bookcraft, Covenant, etc. And I could contact other companies through which I gained my own personal library and was able to buy at wholesale. I even bought the Joseph Smith inspired version of the Bible for the reorganized church. I had all kinds of stuff. I was a student of Mormonism. And I understood the doctrine, the theology that was behind all this. So it did make sense. And yet I couldn't possibly look upon my stepdaughters as equals with my own Aryan children, because they had not been faithful to God in the premortal existence and LDS theology. I had to look upon them as selfish, non-valiant, second-rate people. Not because of their skin color, some of them were fairly white, but because they were descendants of Cain deservingly, because they couldn't stand up for right. They just were selfish in the premortal existence, according to LDS theology. A lot of Mormons nowadays have no clue what LDS theology was, as much of that is hidden from them, and we have lots of PC rhetoric on LDS.org. So this was very damaging. It was hard on my stepdaughters. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was doing the right thing enforcing the modesty standards. Many times going to seminary, I discovered that one of my stepdaughters was dressed immodestly and using a sweater to conceal her wickedness. we'd have to turn around and make everyone else late so she could change her clothes into something acceptable, because the stake president had counseled us in priesthood meetings, brethren, you must not let your daughters out of the house dressed not in accordance with the church standards. So, shaming bodies, shaming children for having any kind of sexual contact. And I'm not advocating girls going out and getting pregnant or boys taking advantage of girls by any means. But what I'm saying is the shaming that goes on contributes to a lot of psychological harm, to a lot of damage and depression, feelings of worthlessness, as I've mentioned before, among heterosexual children and gay kids, who, of course, were told that they just were making evil choices, that there wasn't a natural predisposition, and they were shocked at BYU to try to use barbaric methods to cause people that were having gay feelings to lose them. The LGBT community suffers huge suicidal rates, along with other depressed Mormon children, making it the number one cause of death in Utah for ages 10 or 11 through 17 to this day, far exceeding the national average, and especially blowing away California. The damage that is done in the personal one-on-one interviews with these kids, making them feel like trash, as they are asked to explicitly, by some bishops, describe any sexual forays as soon as they fail in their answer in their worthiness interview, in this invasive, inappropriate worthiness interview that asks them if they obey the Lord's law of chastity, as it is called. In other words, the church's behavioral control standards with regard to sexual and dress activities. Not to mention the word of wisdom, the completely fake so-called revelation telling us that we mustn't drink hot drinks, which have been reinterpreted various times. You can now have hot soup in the Mormon Church. But there was a time when the preachers of Methodism may have influenced those policies. You could drink beer, as it plainly states mild drinks of barley are recommended by the word of wisdom. And then when Prohibition came along, the Mormon Church said, all alcohol makes you unworthy. Granted, alcohol can be dangerous. Lots of people get addicted. It can damage a lot of lives. But Joseph Smith copied what was being taught by the Temperance Society, who had shut down, effectively, the distillery in Kirtland, where he was 3 weeks prior to his revelation, which hot drinks were interpreted as being tea and coffee, since the sisters were known to enjoy a cup of tea. And the brethren wanted to avenge the loss of tobacco, especially that they were so fond of using either smoking or chewing in their priesthood meetings, and then leaving the mess for Emma Smith to clean up, who complained to her husband, thus causing him to need to invent another revelation. The Mormon Church now markets Coca-Cola, Diet Coke even, filled with all sorts of poisonous ingredients in the Lord's law of health. It is not a problem. You can have Diet Coke marketed to you at BYU. Some suspect the church is invested in Coca-Cola stock. But if you have some tea, well, then you've got a problem getting a temple recommend. Of course, we're told caffeine has nothing to do with it, though back in the day, when I was a bit younger, people who were drinking decaffeinated coffee or Postum or whatever, especially decaf, we can look at, were able to get temple recommends because it was decaffeinated. But caffeine has nothing to do with it. The more things change, the more we see the pattern of dishonesty and the pretension that an all-knowing, unchanging God guides the LDS Church through righteous, worthy brethren, whom now we just say are only human, and we have to overlook their faults. Faults such as adultery, murder, I don't know if I want to say racketeering, human trafficking, all the sorts of things that have been done by Joseph Smith in the spiritual wife system in Nauvoo, which the church avoids talking about, or his adultery and taking other men's wives, Brigham Young's adultery, the lying about church history, the Kirtland bank scam, the illegal bank, the fraud perpetrated and saying that God wanted the saints to invest in the bank, and then everybody lost everything. The Danites and the many murders they committed by the direction of Brigham Young. The changing of the story, whether it's the first vision that got invented in 1838, published in 1842, but never spoken of before, the hiding of the seer stone, consecrated through witchcraft, used in the necromancy and treasure-seeking of Joseph Smith as a witch, and then said to be the means by which the Book of Mormon was basically channeled, but they call it translating, and hiding that after that became unpopular. It wasn't really copacetic with the Christian audience they were beginning to gather, and now lying about all sorts of things having to do with that in the Book of Mormon, leaving out important details and telling us that Brigham Young is entirely responsible for the racism in Mormonism, rather than the fact that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Abraham. At the same time, he became a Freemason and brought Freemasonry into the temple, which was completely segregated and probably would have cost him his life earlier had he had Negroes receiving the Masonic signs and tokens in the temple with white brothers who were separated in Freemasonry, and the Negroes were relegated to Prince Hall Freemasonry and not allowed in the Scottish Rite or the York Rite. And it appears that the York Rite brethren organized the Nauvoo Lodge and administered the rites of Freemasonry, and most particularly of the Blue Lodge underneath them, whose signs and tokens are used in the LDS endowment to this day, though the penalties have been dropped. Ironically, 4 years after one of the lords of England at the head of either Scottish or York Rite Freemasonry, and obviously having power over the Blue Lodge, decided to drop the penalties in 1986 of slitting the throat, ripping out the tongue, ripping out the heart and the bowels, all that sort of thing, which you would find brought into the Mormon endowment, which Gordon B. Hinckley eliminated 4 years later, not wanting to look like he was following suit, giving it a little time, so we wouldn't recognize the ongoing connection with Freemasonry and the LDS Church. So my stepdaughters were made to feel bad about themselves because of their choices in the premortal existence, according to Mormonism, since their dad was part Negro. All of the girls were made to feel bad about any sexual activity, and the boys. I just didn't hear the boys talking much about that. All were made to feel guilty for anything sexual, to the point that they were unworthy pieces of trash, basically, or as is so popularly spoken, licked cupcakes. At least that's what girls are called in Mormonism. If they've had any sexual activity, they're licked cupcakes. They're undesirable. And what this does to the psyche of individuals is terrible. What Lamanite girls in the church have experienced, looking at their skin and hoping they can stay out of the sun enough to not look too dark, since the Book of Mormon clearly states that it is a curse from God, so that they will not be attractive to white people. It says that the Lord would make them to be loathsome to the white and delightsome Nephites. And I listened to the interview that Sarah Newcomb gave as a believing Lamanite in the church, a parent from Europe and a parent from the Native American background, and how she tried to keep her skin as light as possible so she wouldn't be looked down upon by the white people in the church. Because that's what we're taught. If you read your scriptures, you'll know what you're supposed to believe is the Word of God. There's so much damage done to people by this church, and so many people using antidepressants for various reasons, whether it's because of their race or because of their sexuality or because they have been expected to be so perfect and can't feel worthy, as so many overwhelmed Mormon women have felt. After all, Spencer Kimball told us we must not do anything to diminish the sizes of our families. I wanted to give the direct quote out of John and Mary lecture, and also found in Marriage, and also found in Faith Precedes the Miracle. He told us not to delay having children and not to do anything to limit the size of our family. I tried to obey that, so I had, 3 children when I was 24, and running a company and having callings, and it was pretty overwhelming. And so many women are completely overwhelmed at home with having so many children. It's hard on their bodies, it's hard on their minds. It's just a tremendous stress financially and emotionally. Paying tithing and having as many children as humanly possible is what we were taught. Not to mention building fund. And I was basically guilted if I was going to save anything to even be able to try to buy a home or have something for my children, because the Lord needed it for building fund. Well, they did away with building fund, at least in the United States, after, somewhere in the 80s, maybe. Maybe it was into the 90s. But yeah, I was giving a tremendous amount of percentage of my income and my time to the church. I had 3 kids by the time I was 24, and the pressure was on. Pressure was too much for that first wife. She had a lot of damage from her Freemason dad and his friends, I think. And things just didn't work out. And she wasn't as valiant in the church. She was a convert, of course. A late convert. Maybe a convert in order to marry some surfer dude. I don't know. But I was disturbed with her lack of valiance in the church when I would say things like, all right, let's have family home evening. And she'd say, you can go to hell. I'm going to watch The Simpsons. I can hear cheering in the Exmo bleachers, but I was trying to follow what would bring a family into the presence of God together, according to my indoctrination, which was hard on the family. When I was younger, I left a job because I was trying to be as valiant and honest as I could, and I had to work with guys that were less than honest in a company where you were pitted in a no-win situation, and sometimes for production versus what they enforced as standards, especially when things were slow, when things were fast, nobody cared. So I quit this, not to mention the fact of all the vulgarity I was around. So at every break, I was, of course, reading Mormon materials. Faith precedes the miracle, miracle of forgiveness, marvelous work and a wonder, the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, doctrines of salvation, volumes 1, 2, and 3. I was reading all that stuff during break time. I had to bail that job because of Mormonism, and because I had integrity, and because I didn't want to be around what I considered to be filth, bad language, that sort of thing. I started working at a job that I was able to get through Mormon connections, where I had the evenings and the nights on separate jobs. One was stocking shelves earlier on, and then later doing cleaning, like the bathrooms, which is not my favorite thing. Well, the Mormon guy that hired me, and he hired all Mormons, being true to the faith, just like if you're a Freemason, you'll hire your brethren and promote them within organizations, which is how they control so much. Well, this guy was trying hard to keep the commandments, he and his wife. I'm not kidding about this. I could be slightly off, but basically they'd been married like 10 years and had like 11 kids and 2 on the way. Maybe they had 9 kids and 2 on the way. I think they had at least 10 kids. Yeah. She was like pregnant, 11 out of every 12 months, basically. I mean, she'd have a baby, and as soon as she healed, she was pregnant. And when I say healed, I'm using that very liberally. Maybe just the stitches out, if she had an episiotomy. I went to their home. They had family prayer. It was like calling the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, Ephraim, Sarah, on and on and on. Reuben, I don't think they'd use Reuben. That's too unfaithful. Isaac, Jacob. Yeah, and I looked at this woman, and I thought, how does she do it? And I looked at this man. He worked all day at a job, 7 till 4. And then he started again about 6 or 7 o'clock on the night job that he was moonlighting on. He got done at 3 o'clock in the morning. He had between 3 and 7 to go home, shower, sleep, and impregnate his wife again. Except, of course, on the weekends. He got off. I mean, the guy was a walking zombie, but he was faithful to Mormonism. And I looked at them and I thought, they were building shelves in their military housing to put the children on. They had a small 3-bedroom home with 10 or 11 children. They built shelves on the walls for their kids to sleep on because they followed the prophet, Spencer W. Kimball. Now, Jesus changed his mind. You just handle whatever is copacetic for your entire situation, mentally, physically, spiritually, financially. Maybe that's more what is taught now. That's pretty much what my bishop said to me one time when I said, hey, dude, I'm here pumping out all these kids, helping pump out the kids, supporting them, and I noticed that you've got like these 4-year intervals between children and you quit after 4, dude. What's up? And he basically said, well, it's what you can handle. I said, well, that's not what Spencer Kimball said. That's not at all what Spencer Kimball said. He was very specific. And thus, Mormonism put an enormous stress on me, my family, and many other families, which is why you see so many foreclosures and bankruptcies in Utah. The fruits of the gospel are bankruptcy, divorce, suicide, depression, antidepressants, racism, shunning of those of us who leave the church, and misery. The church does more to divide families than possibly any organization I know of. This is why I hate the church. This is why I hate the brethren, because they know what they're doing. The guys at the top. Maybe some of the 70 haven't become aware that it's all a fraud. I don't know. I'm sure the apostles, they know, and they're using NLP on us all the time. And then you've got these little junior apologists, marketers for the church, trying to show how modern and cool it is to be Mormon, like Kwaku, L meaning God. Isn't that a lovely, humble name? Kwaku L, whose video on why he believes in Joseph Smith I kind of dissected yesterday, because I believe he, like many of these others, are completely dishonest. Although there are many who are just so mind-washed and unconsciously exercising so much cognitive dissonance to protect their belief while they try to be valiant in the testimony of Jesus, as they're told, and destroy their families and let their brothers die so their house will be worthy of the Spirit of the Lord. And that's what I blew up on my son about. That and some other conduct that I felt was indicative of the phony authority of the priesthood and of our society run by these Freemasons that run the LDS Church, our political and judicial system, basically all sorts of companies, because of the block voting used by these privately held corporations that govern us. And the electing they do of boards of governors from their fraternal organizations, primarily the Luciferian Freemasons. I mentioned before that my first wife's father was a Freemason. I don't know how high in the Luciferian religion he had evolved, but we know that in his secret office, he harbored a picture of him holding a man's head by the hair. Did he murder the man? I don't know. Was the guy already dead and that he decapitated him? I don't know. But sometimes he forgot to hold on to his keys. And there are those of his descendants that got a hold of them, and several have viewed his sick picture holding the guy's head. Is that a requirement for certain levels? Was he a 32nd or 33rd degree Scottish Rite brother? I don't know, but I know he was evil. And I know the influences I saw when I entered their temple, and the connection with Mormonism that was told to me by one of their brethren, since my wife at that time was the queen of the Job's daughters, meaning at least your father had to be a master mason. And I learned more and more of the connections between Freemasonry and Mormonism, and noted, last of all, the Masonic handshake given by President Gordon B. Hinckley to Dick Cheney, and the Masonic handshake given by Thomas Monson to George Bush, as they promoted these two mass murderers and their agenda in the Middle East to the members of the LDS Church, using those grips that we see used over the altar and last at the veil in the Mormon temple ceremonies, stolen from Freemasonry. And I had to ask myself, why are these guys using these sacred tokens of the holy priesthood out in the open with these mass murderers that they're promoting? Then I realized it wasn't just Joseph, Brigham, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow who were Freemasons guiding the LDS Church, that the Luciferians always had control. And I hate these guys so much because they've destroyed my family with their doctrines, their teachings, and the damage that it's done. Or at least they've contributed heavily to that and to the unhappiness that so many people have experienced, and so many deaths, and the cover-up of so much pedophilia in their pedophilia rings linked with the Roman Catholic priests and their Freemasonic brethren in many other churches. Why should I not hate these horrible men who deceive us knowingly and deceive so many good people that care about one another and are used, and whose efforts are manipulated to glorify the God of Mormonism and this multi-billion-dollar criminal organization, and bring it more money, more power, more influence over the lives of others, and bring more death upon innocent people. No, I should hate it. And so sometimes I blow up. And now my son has gone ahead and not spoken to me. He has cut me off from communication because he believes that I'm an impure vessel, no doubt, that I've used language and called the brethren names which are very fitting and appropriate, yet this language is something that you would expect from a sailor. Sorry, sailors. How about a drunken sailor? I don't know. Not in proper company. Because we're taught, as we're taught with modesty, that certain words are terrible and mean you're bad. Well, when I use something, it's not to be vulgar usually. It's to communicate hatred. And so, to the brethren, I give a big F you this morning. And to my son, I invite, if you ever listen to this, go ahead and talk to me like your sister did. Talk with me if we have a disagreement. If I use language that's offensive, that's just the way it is, because it communicates hatred, not towards you, but towards the system which has influenced you and the decisions that you made that I'm upset with, that harmed other people, including me. In the name of the Age of Reason, I'm out.